Welcome to Native Bidaské. I'm Levi Rickert, publisher and editor of Native News Online. You are joining our weekly spotlight on people making news and leading change in Indian country. Today we have a very special guest, and it is Assistant Secretary of the Interior for Indian Affairs, Bryan Newland. Welcome, Bryan.
Bonjour, how you doing, Levi?
Bonjour, I'm doing well. Thank you for coming on, and miigwech. We also have Jenna, who has covered, for those of you who read Native News Online, she has covered the Indian boarding school very extensively during the last year. So we wanted Jenna to be part of the interview team today. So welcome, Jenna.
Thanks, Levi.
Yes. And last week, the Department of the Interior released its full report on 106 pages of the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative Investigative Report. And Assistant Secretary Newland was at the press conference. It was quite emotional press conference. And Bryan, if you don't mind, just talk about what you're feeling when you're in the room that day.
Well, obviously the boarding school system has affected every single Native person in this country, whether they realize it or not, whether they attended the boarding schools or whether their parents did. We all live with its legacies, from the lack of language speakers in so many communities to broken families. And I say broken families, I mean families that are literally broken up from people being sent to boarding schools and some kids not making it home. And knowing that I'm a part of that legacy as well, and also knowing that some of my ancestors and relatives had gone, and trying to just put myself in their shoes and the experiences of folks, of kids who went to these boarding schools. I mean, it's weighty, it's emotional. You can't be an empathetic person and not feel that. And so it was an emotional day for me, for the secretary, for everybody involved. I think you saw some of that boil over for me at the press conference. But when I was talking to my daughter the night before about this, she said something that was very poignant and powerful. And I was explaining the boarding school system to her. She said, "They're just kids." And that really, just that simple statement from her really hit me, because we are talking about, as the report says, this federal policy targeted kids. It wasn't a federal policy aimed at adults who had a choice, or in the abstract. It was a deliberate targeting of kids. And so when you think about that and think that some of these kids were our relatives and our ancestors, it gets emotional, because you think about your own kids and the kids in your life and being asked to bear the brunt of something like this.
And quite frankly, it was that emotion spilled over to our newsroom as well. Yeah. Someone was really choked up that day, and so just a real sadness. And sad to say, it's almost as if a scab was removed over and over again as we deal with it. So, Jenna, why don't you ask the next question?
Yeah, so this leads really well into what we're first hoping to ask you, Bryan, which is, how have you and your staff been taking care of themselves, but specifically you? What have you been doing to take care of yourself over these past 9 months of writing this report and really living this report?
For me, I try to, in a job like this, and having come from being a tribal leader, especially during the pandemic, I learned the hard way about prioritizing self-care. And I always try to make sure I do the basics, get enough sleep, pray, eat good food, exercise, do all that stuff. But with our team, I'm glad you're asking that, because that's something that folks don't often think about in the context of this work. We asked our team, most of whom are Native or come from tribal communities, to sit with this information day after day after day and stare it in in the face and think about it and figure out how we want to convey this to the American people. And it was a lot. We placed not only just the burden of doing the work, but a lot of emotional burden on our team. And, from the secretary to myself and all the way down, we tried to make sure that we were emphasizing to the folks on our team who were doing this research and doing the writing of the report to take care of themselves, step away from your work if you need to, and that we were being mindful that we were tasking them with an emotional burden. And they really bore that burden, excuse me. So I'm really appreciative that you thought to even ask that question, because that's something that I think most of the American public will not appreciate or understand, is how difficult that part of this work was for our team.
Right. And will continue to be with the continued investigation. We're also, as this investigation continues, and Holland announced the Road to Healing that she's sort of spearheading to visit tribal communities and speak to them about their stories and record those stories. We're wondering what that will look like. Will all 574 federally recognized tribes have a chance to share their stories with the federal government? And what about tribal community members that may have gone to boarding school that aren't federally recognized?
Okay. So that's a great question. When we went out to tribal consultation this past winter on carrying out this research and putting this first report together, we heard from a number of folks that you shouldn't be just talking with elected tribal leadership about this. We should be hearing directly from survivors and their families. And so we want to make sure that we are providing a forum and a space for survivors and family members to come forward and share their experience, good or bad, with the boarding school system, so we could get it on record. I understand that not every person who went to boarding school and may want to come forward and share their story publicly, and that's okay. But we want to make sure we're providing a space for people who do want to come forward and share their experience and how it affected them and their family members, and get that on the record to help fill out this picture of what the federal Indian boarding school system really was and the personal impacts of it. You see in volume 1 of our report that we've laid out the intent behind the policy and described its implementation and the scope of it, but we haven't yet painted the picture for the American people about the human impact of this system and the impact, why it's relevant today. This is not something that should be dismissed as a gratuitous pointing backward to history. This is an impact that is felt by Indian people today. It has an impact on communities and families today, and we want to make sure we're painting that whole picture. And so I don't know that we'll be able to make it out to every single tribal community throughout this Healing Road process. We also know that because of policies like the boarding school policy and adopting out, which followed on the boarding school era, that a lot of Native people live in urban communities far from their reservations and their families back home. We want to make sure that we're reaching folks where they are in those communities as well, and that we're providing opportunity for as many people as we can to share their story, knowing that we won't, in a year's time, between the secretary and myself, be able to hear from every single person in every community. But we want to begin this process. We're at step 1.
Well, thank you. And Bryan, real quick, and I know we have very limited time today. Can you speak to the process in terms of the discovery of more graves? I know Shannon Martin, and I think you know Shannon, was spoke in Grand Rapids last June and said that they had identified 227 graves up at the closed down Mount Pleasant Industrial School, but the government would only at that time admit to 5. So I guess my question is, what's the process of trying to bring together a real factual number of, is it possible to even get there, of those graves that are out there that are in the boarding school system?
Well, we're going to do our best to try, Levi. Again, a lot of the records that we know that the federal government had relating to Indian affairs generally were not well kept. And we know that a lot of these cemeteries and burial sites were not well marked or protected. But we're going to try to paint an accurate picture and also protect those places where kids were buried. And sometimes protection may mean not disclosing or sharing that information. And also, when it comes to repatriation, we heard very clearly during our consultation process that tribes have different views on repatriation. Some folks, want to bring their kids home. We saw that last summer with the Rosebud Sioux tribe and bringing kids home from Carlisle. And we heard from other tribes that it's our cultural and spiritual obligation to allow those kids to rest where they were buried. And so we want to make sure that we are very careful in how we do this work, that we're thoughtful and respectful, knowing that Indian country doesn't have one view about how to protect these sites, whether to repatriate kids and bring their bodies home to their homelands. And we're going to take our time to make sure we do it right. And also knowing that at the end of the day, because of record keeping, because of physical access to some of these places, that we may not detail precisely we may not be able to provide the precise number of kids who died at these boarding schools and where they were buried, but we're going to do our best to paint the full picture and tell the whole story.
Well, we really salute what you and Secretary Holland are doing. Two strong Native people who are, in our eyes, warriors, and is a very, very difficult subject to deal with. And so I really do applaud that. And the sensitivity of which you're approaching the whole process, I think, is so critical. And in Indian country, and you know that, Bryan, that is you have to, in Indian country, we have to walk real quietly sometimes. It may take a little longer than some people think it should, but sometimes that's the best thing to do, is take the time and do it correctly with a great deal of cultural sensitivity. So I do applaud that. And,
well, thank you, Levi.
One more question for Jenna, or do you need to go?
I'm going to need to jump, but if I can just respond to what you just said is, we do want to do this carefully and thoughtfully and respectfully, respect people's dignity as well. But the other important part is that we do this now. And Indian country and Indian people have waited long enough for the United States federal government to acknowledge the existence of these boarding schools and why they were put in place. It's time that we tell this story. So we're proceeding. We're going to continue our work, and we'll do it respectfully and thoughtfully.
Yes. Well, thank you, sir. And Chief McGwitch, to you, we really appreciate you taking time for Native News Online. And to our viewers out there, thank you for tuning in. And next week we'll have another guest. And one thing about it, be very clear, Native News Online is not done. As long as the Department of the Interior is investigating, we will be there to cover these stories because it's so critically important. And I really appreciate you, Assistant Secretary Newland, coming on today. And I appreciate what your daughter said. It's about the kids. That is very meaningful. So
you betcha. You betcha.
Thank you very much, Bryan.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care.